Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Uncensored CMO. Now, I've got a treat for you in this episode. I've got guest number one, the very, very first person I ever interviewed on this podcast, coming back, Richard Shotton. Now, Richard, as many of you know, is the author of many books. He's a behavioural science expert. He has a new book out called Hacking the Human Mind. Now, what I love about this book in particular is the fact that he starts with the brand and works back to uncover the behavioural science insights that made the brand a success. So if you wonder why Guinness became Britain's #1 pint, or why Liquid Death succeeded in the water category, or why Red Bull tastes awful but somehow has become majorly successful, Richard uncovers the behavioural science tricks that those brands used, and you can learn from them too. So we're catching up with Richard in this episode to find out all about them. Here it is. Well, congratulations on book number 3. So we started out talking about obviously Choice Factory and then Illusions of Choice, and here we are with book number 3, which is just about to hit the shelves, isn't it?
Yeah, week Tuesday it'll hit the shelves, and it's slightly different from previous ones. Partly it's co-authored, and then secondly with a brilliant guy called Michael Aaron Flicker, and then secondly I flipped the book on its head slightly. So with the Choice Factory and the Illusion of Choice, every chapter starts with a bias, the evidence of that bias, the experiments I've done, and then the implications. This one, it starts with a brand. So one chapter's about Guinness, one chapter's about Liquid Death, a little potted history of the brand, and then we talk about the 1 or 2 principles that they've used that have partly powered their success. So it's brand first this time around.
Got to say, you made my job really easy, right? Because like the last 2 times I've been going, right, understand the behavioural science, get my head around it, and then make the jump to what does it mean for marketers. This one, you've done all the hard work for me. I'm like, oh, there you go. Like, start with like the thing everyone knows it's famous for, and then work back to the behavioural science.
Absolutely, and it's removing that leap. I get frustrated that I think behavioural science is this amazing repository, this amazing catalogue of insights that can help improve marketing. But if you just talk about the experiments, sometimes people feel it's complicated or hard to use. If you start with a well-known brand using this idea, I think it makes it easier for people to see how they can apply it on their products. So, well, I'm glad you like that.
Absolutely. Now, maybe it's salience that's doing this, but having read your book, I did feel like a pint of Guinness. So anyone watching this will be able to see. I brought some Guinness. I thought we'd celebrate your new book launch with Guinness.
Like
so, feel free to jump on in.
Excellent.
And then maybe we can talk a bit about Guinness. There we go. Everyone heard that, didn't they? And you mentioned in your book the famous notion that Guinness takes a long time to serve. And I was intrigued by how long does a pint of Guinness take to serve?
Oh, good question. Is that you're asking me?
Yeah.
Just under 2 minutes. There is a specific number, but I would struggle to tell you exactly the number.
Well, I mean, James and I actually ended up over at the Guinness Storehouse. We recorded an episode. Yeah. This must have been about 18 months ago. We actually met a guy called Colin, who is like this world famous expert on how to pour a Guinness. He's done, he's poured David Beckham a pint. He's poured Rihanna a pint. Yeah. And honestly, it's amazing what he can tell you. But I thought I would find out from Google, actually, whether there's actually a precise answer to how long it actually takes. Let me see if we can find out. Hey, Google, I want to know how long does it take to pour the perfect pint of Guinness? Ooh, there we go. All right, here we go. The perfect pint of Guinness takes precisely 119.5 seconds to pour, including a 2-stage process that allows the beer to settle and form its signature creamy head. There you go. And apparently you should pour to about 3/4 at a 45-degree angle, waiting for the surge to settle, and then you top it off from there to create the perfect head.
Okay.
There you go.
Well, so Guinness is one of the chapters. We don't talk about precision in the chapter, but I think that argument or their discussion of it being 119.5 seconds rather than roughly 2 minutes, they're onto something there as well. There's a brilliant study from Schindler at Rutgers University, and he shows people ads for a deodorant, and sometimes he says it reduces perspiration by 50%, sometimes he says it reduces perspiration by 47% or 53%. Half people see 47, half 53. And when he asks people as to how accurate they think this claim is and how credible they think the claim is, people who see the precise number, they rate the claim 10% more accurate, 5% more credible than the people who saw the round number. And Schindler's argument is essentially, over time, people learn that those who know what they're talking about, they tend to speak specifically, they tend to speak precisely. Those who are just, thinking it up on the hoof, who are just wildly speculating, they give you a round answer. And this association has become so wedded in people's minds, it's taken on a life of its own. So you say to someone it takes 119 seconds to pour a Guinness, and they think, oh gosh, that must be for a very, very specific reason. If you say it just takes 2 minutes, it feels like an unimportant piece of trivia. So even on that little element, I like what they're doing there.
Now, I know this rather personally, because when you came on the podcast last time, for the first time rather, I was really desperate for 5-star reviews, right? Yeah. And so I was kind of like, you're messaging everybody listening, I'd love to get a review, because everyone who starts out wants the social proof of 5-star reviews. When I spoke to you about this, I actually thought, maybe a 4.9 is better. So someone messaged me and said how much they'd enjoyed the episode. And I said, I'd love a review. Can you not give me a 5-star review? Yeah. And they went and put a 4-star review. I instantly regretted it after that, because it dragged my average down to 4.7. I was like, oh, damn it. But anyway, there's something about a non-precise number that does make it more believable.
So this leads into the Pratfall effect a bit. There is a study by Northwestern University where they looked at 100,000 odd product reviews, and these are all quantifications, so they're all I think 1 to 5. And what they find is that as the score of the product gets better, as you'd expect, purchasing becomes more likely. But then for every product, every category, and they look at 25, 26 categories, there is a turning point. So it's something like between 4.2 and 4.8 for FMCG products. You start getting higher than that, and you begin to see a downturn in terms of purchase. And the argument from the psychologist was perfection is too good to be true. What's more likely? There's this brand that's absolutely perfect, without flaw, or the marketer has been airbrushing out the negative comments. So you see 5-star reviews, and often people will think it's spurious. I think there is an argument that a 4.9 would be better. It's more believable. Now, where that line is it 4.2, is it 4.9? I think that's very category dependent. And if most podcasts are very high, you might see that threshold is at 4.95, not 4.7.
Yeah. I have to say, Pratfall is my favourite behavioural science thing. I try and think of, any time I do a presentation, is there a little Pratfall I could bring in at the beginning of my presentation just to get the audience on my side, isn't it? Because people kind of like a stumble, a bit of imperfection, because it just makes you human, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So if people haven't heard this phrase before, it's the idea that a product or a person that exhibits a flaw becomes more appealing. And that the classic study was 1966, this amazing Harvard psychologist called Elliot Aronson. And he gets a colleague to take part in a quiz. He gives the colleague all the answers. So this guy goes to the quiz, gets 92% of the questions right, wins it by miles, looks like a complete genius. But then as the quiz is finishing, he makes what an American in the 60s would have called a pratfall. So what we would just call a small blunder. He spills a cup of coffee down himself. Aronson takes this recording and then he plays it to listeners. But sometimes he plays the entire incident. Other times he plays an edited version, so people just hear the amazing quiz performance. And then Aronson asks all those listeners to rate the likability of the contestant. And the core finding, and there are nuances and there are variations, but the core finding is people who hear the flaw as well as the great performance, they rate the contestant 45% more likeable than those who just heard the amazing quiz performance. So it's this argument that often if you exhibit a flaw, you become more human, you become more likeable, you look like less of a threat. And I think that's something that, yes, Guinness have emphasised. They talked about good things come to those who wait. They've talked about the slowness of the pour. I think the more brands could use this principle, because it's a very powerful one.
Now, there is a major caveat to this, isn't there?
Yes.
A huge caveat that you need to be competent in the first place, don't you? You can't just make a series of blunders and that. You've got to have some competence that precedes it, right?
So in that example, quiz contestant gets 92%, Aronson did a variation of the study, new group of people, and he tells the contestant to look like a dunce, he looked like an idiot, and he tells him to get 35% of the questions right. Now, in that scenario, if listeners heard the really poor quiz performance and the spillage, they like that person less than if they heard just the poor performance. So it seems to have this magnifying effect. I think what we can be certain of is if you've got perceived competence, Pratfall effect works for you. If you are perceived to be incompetent, it can make the situation worse. So if you're a brand like Guinness, you've been around since 1759, you're respected in the world of stouts and lagers, this is definitely something you can use. If you are, I don't know, let's say VW, the day after there's been the emissions scandal, maybe you don't want to be admitting flaws or extra flaws on top of that.
Yeah.
You want to be doing it from a position of strength.
Now, sticking on the drink theme as well, one of the drinks that is just like everywhere now is Aperol Spritz.
Yeah.
And I find it curious because Aperol goes back to like the 1920s or something, doesn't it?
Yes.
So it's around 100 years old as a brand, but it seemed to have exploded in the last 10 years. Like, and why did something that, let's be honest, it doesn't really taste very good. It's quite a challenging drink.
Yeah.
Right. How did they end up turning, what is a very niche bitter into something that you just see everywhere?
So I think what happened here is they have a little success. And, I'm not 100% sure why this happens. They have a little success. Maybe there's a bit more of a marketing spend. Maybe, there's just an element of randomness that an influencer picks it up. But once they've got a little bit of success, that's when the behavioural science principle kicks in, because that success becomes self-sustaining. And I think the reason for that is Aperol's distinctiveness. You go to a bar and you order a gin and tonic. 99 times out of 100, no one knows what you're drinking once you've walked away from the bar. It's a transparent, clear liquid. Gordon's, Tanqueray, in the glass, they're all interchangeable. Aperol has a very distinctive colour. It has a very distinctive serve in those balloon glasses. You only have to have a couple of people drinking Aperol, and it looks like it's a popular choice because they are so noticeable, so distinctive. Now, that might feel like wild speculation, but there's a brilliant study by Kees Keizer at the university. Do you have any Dutch listeners?
Yeah, no, very popular in Holland. Yeah.
Damn, because I don't know how to pronounce this. If you'd said no, I'd have said, well, okay, yeah. But perfectly pronounced. I think it's the University of Groningen, but I expect some criticism or being picked up on that. But anyway, 2008, he finds an alleyway in the Netherlands. Loads of people park their bikes in this alleyway. And crucially for the experiment, there's no bin. So he goes down in the morning and he puts flyers for a fictitious sports shop on the handlebars of the bikes. And then he wanders off a few yards and stealthily monitors what do those returning cyclists do with the flyer. There's no bin, remember. So they have a choice. They either chuck them on the floor or, like good citizens, they take them home with them. Keizer sets up the study one of two ways. Sometimes he has gone down very early and he has cleaned up the alleyway. He's made it absolutely spotless. 0 litter, no graffiti. And in that setting, 33% of people litter. Other occasions, he's gone down to the same alleyway, does all the same things with the flyer on the handlebars, but this time he makes the alleyway a complete tip. Spray paints it with graffiti, chucks loads of litter around. Now, what he's doing here is he's making it look like the social norm is to litter. The first setup, it looks like most people take their litter home. In this second setup, it looks like most people litter. And when he does that, there is a more than doubling of littering rates. We're up to 69% of people littering. Now, this is a really powerful application of social proof. So social proof is the argument that if you tell people you're popular, you become more popular still, you become more appealing. We're deeply influenced by what others are doing. But if you tell people directly, I sell, you could say, I've got 100,000 listeners, or Ford could say they've got the best selling car in the world. If you directly say it, you invite skepticism. But if people think they've come to their own conclusions, frankly, who do they trust more than themselves? That's what happens in the littering study, and I think it's what's benefiting Aperol as well. They don't necessarily go out and say they're a super popular spirit, But you notice, it's so distinctive. You see this trend ballooning, blossoming in front of you. And that, I think, is something that far more brands can apply. What brands need to do is think to themselves, is the consumption of my product or the purchasing of my product visible or invisible, private or public? And if it's private and invisible, you need to think to yourself, how do I make it as public and noticeable as possible? And if you do that, you're applying one of the most powerful biases in one of the most powerful ways.
I learned this actually very early on in my career. So I started out at Britvic, and this is probably 20 years ago now, but we launched a juice in pubs called J2O. If you wind back...
My mother is a big purchaser.
Oh, really? Yeah. It's one of those, actually, a slight aside, but it's one of those amusing ones where you are not the customer as the brand team. The brand team are all kind of trendy people in their 20s. And they do all this advertising to people in their 20s, and then someone actually bothered to look at who consumes it. Under 18s and over 60s. It's basically, if you're driving or if you're not legal to have an alcoholic drink. Because basically, if anyone who doesn't know, it's a very British thing, but it's like a juice in a beer bottle, in effect. However, that wasn't what I was going to say. The reason it links to this is quite fascinating, because at the time, soft drinks were seen as, they were number 3 on the list. So you'd have like food, where people make the most money. Alcohol would be number 2. Soft drinks were a distant number 3. So the objective of every bar was to serve soft drinks as efficiently as possible. So you either have draft, so literally it comes from the gun, or you have no more than 200 ml in a glass bottle. It gets served and then the glass bottle is thrown away. When J2O launched, they launched in a 275 ml. The bottle was very slightly too big, and it caused a massive backlash from the publicans. The publicans were like, well, we're going to have to we're going to get a tiny little bit of juice left after we poured it into the drink with the ice. But it forced them to hand over the bottle. And it did what you said about Aperol Spritz, because everyone's seeing what everyone else is drinking. Before then, you didn't know. Even Coke and Pepsi, you wouldn't know. It's the same brand,
if the bottle was 25 millilitres smaller, they'd have turned around, chucked it in the bin, and everyone would have thought they're just drinking oranges. Can you imagine all the complaints in the
development process? People going, this bottle's a bit too big, from the publican's point of view, but actually not giving in to what the publican wanted actually did the right thing for the brand.
I didn't know that. I knew about Magners, who had done something similar, where back in the late 90s, early 2000s, most pint glasses weren't branded. So you ordered a pint of cider normally and no one knew what you're drinking. But Magners did I don't want to say the word revolutionary, because to anyone who doesn't work in marketing, putting some ice in a glass is not revolutionary. But for us, this revolutionary act of putting ice in the pint glass, which meant when you got your 500 milliliter bottle, it wouldn't...
There you go.
You wouldn't have enough space to pull it all away. So people would take their Magners bottle away with their pint glass. So that product became distinctive, noticeable. And yet again, you get this virtuous circle of social proof.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a lovely example.
Yeah, the win there wasn't the ice, calling it the drink. The win there was forcing the bottle onto the table.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yes.
Fascinating. Yeah. Sticking with drinks as well, one of the chapters I enjoyed a lot, because I've had the founder of the podcast, Mike Cesario, was Liquid Death.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to talk about Liquid Death, because a lot of people don't understand why it works. Because in theory, the dumbest thing you could do is take a water brand and literally call it the antithesis of why you drink water, literally Liquid Death. And then you put it in a can, it's not in a bottle, it's priced at 4 or 5 times the price of a bottle of water. It doesn't make any sense. What behavioural science can help unpick why Liquid Death has been so successful?
And splitting out that way, there were quite a few different elements there. But I think the one that is most striking about what they did would be the von Restorff effect. So this is the idea that stretches back to 1933, that we notice what's distinctive. So the original study was done by this brilliant German psychologist called Hedwig von Restorff, who's at the University of Berlin. And a super simple study. Reads out lists of words and twisting it slightly, but it's basically 10 items, 9 animals, say, and 1 bit of furniture. So you go cat, dog, table, elephant, giraffe, so on and so forth. She reads these lists out, and then she asks people what they can remember. And again and again and again, it is the distinctive item that really stings in people's minds. If you give people a long list of animals with 1 bit of furniture, it'll be the furniture they remember, or vice versa. If you gave them a long list of furniture with 1 animal in there, they'd remember the animal. So that became known as the von Restorff effect, or the isolation effect. And it is one of the most well-proven, long-standing ways of capturing attention. Now, what I think Liquid Death did so brilliantly is they thought to themselves, well, what are all the different category conventions in the water market? And then they thought, well, which ones do we have to adhere to? Maybe there's a very good reason, and we'll leave those well alone. And then which ones are there just for convention's sake? And it was those unnecessary conventions that everyone else was adopting. That's what they smashed to smithereens. Every other brand had pictures of, alpine scenes, idyllic, bucolic nature. They have, cartoon characters chopping each other's heads off. It was the complete antithesis of what the category stood for. And for a small brand with minimal marketing spend, that supercharged their impact. You're getting over the first hurdle of advertising. If you behave distinctively, you're much, much more likely to be noticed.
Yeah. Now, every now and then you see a big brand try and pretend to be Liquid Death, right? So often brands will do some big stunt and then they'll get caught out. But there's something about the consistency with which they do it, which is critical here, isn't it? So anyone listening thinking I'm going to do something crazy on my traditional laundry detergent brand that's dated back 100 years, think before you go crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got this first principle of von Restorff effect. The second one, and this might be another opportunity for me to butcher a pronunciation, there's an idea called the mere exposure effect. So mere as in MERE, not NEAR. And it's essentially the idea that familiarity breeds contentment, not contempt. So the original study was Robert Zionch, I think that's how you say it, back in the 1950s, 1960s, University of Michigan. And he gets Americans who only speak English. That's a kind of key thing. And he shows them words from Turkish. And he gives them this big book. And essentially open a page and there'll be a word. You'll flick a page and there's another word. You flick the page and another word. They then get to the end and all the words are listed out and people have to guess what those words mean. Now, the twist in the experiment was some of the words were shown once, some twice, some 3, some 4, some up to like 15 or 20 times. And what Zion shows is the positivity that people give the words, it increases with repetition. So if you saw the word once, you might give it a neutral meaning. If you saw a different word 10 times, you're more likely to give it a positive one. Now, what's interesting here is think about that experiment. It's flicking through a book. It's being exposed to the words. There's no information being given with extra frequency. It's just repetition. That's why he calls it the mere exposure effect. And it's this idea that the more we see something, the warmer we become to it. Now, you could argue about what reason underlies this. I would be tempted to take an evolutionary one, that for most of our evolutionary history, if you've seen or been exposed to a stimuli and it hasn't killed you, then you know it's safe, then you warm to it, then you're drawn towards it. I think there's something in that evolutionary explanation. But regardless of the underlying explanation, it's definitely something marketers could apply. Now, you've got to be very, very careful about cutting and changing creative style, cutting and changing direction, because what the mere exposure effect suggests is if you've built up this heritage, this warmth to a character or a visual style, even if you're changing something that is objectively better, it will probably perform worse because it isn't benefiting from that mere exposure effect. So stick to things unless there is a very good reason to change.
Got some amazing data on this actually. So System 1, we did a collaboration with the Effie's data. So we took the Effie's worldwide database, hundreds of thousands of data points in there. System 1 database, which is measuring emotion to predict outcomes. We crashed them together to work out, how does the System 1 emotional measure link to the business results seen by the brands that won Effie's. And there were some expected insights, right? So, for example, an expected insight is that if you use emotion, that does better than rational persuasion, right? So that, kind of think that's great. If you are highly branded, you did better. And ideally, if you used emotion and good branding, you do better than the ones that are forgettable and not branded. The real interesting insight that proves exactly your point is that then when you extrapolate those over years, the gap between the well-branded strong emotion campaigns versus the dull, not branded campaigns, the gap just got wider and wider and wider. Yeah. So there's this incredible compounding effect of the consistent execution of campaigns. So the longer you ran a campaign that worked, key point, if it didn't work, it stayed not working.
Yeah.
If it did work, the longer you ran the campaign for, the gap between the non-working and the working just got bigger and bigger. And we only looked at it over 3 years.
Yeah.
I'd guess that probably continues and gets even bigger after 5 or 6.
So what I like about the combination of those two things is you've got the academic experiment where they keep all things equal and they kind of prove a point. And then you've got the real world kind of replication of that with ads and a data set. But I think it's the two coming together that's powerful. Because previously when I've heard people say, ads that run a long time tend to perform better, I originally was quite sceptical about that because I thought, well, this is just survivorship bias. If an ad's bloody awful, people will stop running it. Of course, things that have run for 50 years are going to be amazing because they've had so many chances of being killed. But I think you put the two things together and the only plausible explanation is some of the strength, some of the success is consistency. Some of it is repetition.
Yeah, in the mere exposure effect, exactly as you say.
Now, and it's one that, you think all these biases, I think it's one that most marketers rail against, because if there is a characteristic to marketers, it's generally that we're interested in novelty, we're excited by different things. So it's a finding that probably runs counter to most of our characters. So we've really got to, I think, try doubly hard to appreciate the experiment and try and apply it more.
I did a couple of posts actually on consistency and impact, and in fact someone commented and said, why do I think that is? And the list goes on forever. I mean, I started thinking about it. I think incentives, financial incentives of agencies to make new work, annual planning cycles, the very fact that every year we rewrite a plan again, and we the turnover of marketeers, the fact that that probably most junior marketers are enroll 18 months, 2 years, the desire to prove yourself and make something, and
personal motivations,
winning awards, the entire awards, like there's no award for running the same campaign twice.
Yes.
Right? So but everything is set up to encourage change, to encourage you to change it rather than actually rerun the same thing.
I imagine you're at a job interview and someone said, so what did you do? I said, well, I took over the Kit Kat advertising and I kept it exactly the same. Yeah. They'd be like, oh my God, get rid of this man and get someone else in. Whereas, that's irrelevant. What you should be thinking about is, well, was that the right decision to maximise profit in that situation? Yeah, I think there are an awful lot of personal and industry incentives to ignore this principle.
Exactly. Now, sticking to the drink theme, the drink theme was very fruitful in your book, I have to say. There's some really good drink examples. One of the brands, when I started my career in soft drinks, was a phenomenon, was Red Bull. Yes, and again, Red Bull is another one that does not make any sense because it's ridiculously expensive. At the time, it was in a small can. It was like half the size of a normal serve. It broke the number one rule of a drink, which is you must taste good. I mean, I've got so much research that says you only sell if you taste good. There's a very tight correlation between the better it tastes and what it sells. They absolutely broke that. And the only brand that I've come across that fundamentally breaks Byron Sharp's double jeopardy law in that they've got a lot of very loyal buyers. Everything else is a distribution curve. What's it called? Reverse binomial. Whatever. It's like a ski slope downhill. So you've got a very few buyers that drink a lot.
That's a far better descriction than a reverse binomial. I now know what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Let's impress, but I understand.
It's like a reverse ski jump. The reverse ski jump curve. We'll rebrand it. There you go. Byron, you have that on for free. But basically, a very few number of buyers drink a lot, and a lot of buyers drink a little, and that's the only brand I've seen where actually most consumption is from heavy buyers, and it really bucks the trend. Red Bull's very interesting because it does do a lot of things that go against convention.
Yes. So I think I first heard Rory Sutherland talking about this. I think it was a British brands lecture, and it's I might actually try and re-download it because it was a brilliant speech, and it's still available. It was available online for completely free. And what he talks about is you go back to that era when Red Bull launched, and most soft drinks came in 330ml squat cans. What Red Bull did is shrink the serving, so it's 250ml, and it was in that tall, thin can. Now, why that's so important is most people, when they think about what is a fair price to pay, think about that question relatively, not absolutely. So what I mean by that is, rather than, let's say with this Guinness, me thinking, how much happiness am I going to get? And then having my own kind of internal willingness to pay per unit of happiness. People don't think of questions like that in that absolute sense because they're ludicrously complex. What people do instead is think, okay, well, how much would I pay for a Carling or a Foster's? And then if I like Guinness more, I'll just adjust up a bit or I'll adjust down a bit. So we have this mental comparison set that we have for every product that we allow to shape our willingness to pay. Now go back to, well, firstly, let's kind of prove that. I've done this 5 or 6 times. The one that I can remember the data on was probably about 7 or 8 years ago. I showed people a box of PG tips, and I said, I don't know, I'll make the costs up. Let's say it was £2 for a 250 gram box, and next to it was a £1 box of Tesco, same size. And I said to people, how good's value is the PG tips? And 31% of people say it's good value. New group of people, get rid of the Tesco, leave the PG tips there, and then put a box of Twinings next to it for, say, £3.50. Ask the people again how good value. This is a new group of people. Ask them how good value the PG tips is. And the number jumps to 65%. So you've got a more than doubling. Now, that simple experiment is interesting because what it shows is it's not just the inherent quality of PG tips that is driving valuation. Because if it was, the numbers would be roughly the same. What people are doing is just latching onto a benchmark, and that is influencing their thoughts. So if they see something very expensive next to the PG tips, it looks good value. If they see something very cheap, it looks bad value. So there's definite experimental proof into this idea of price relativity. But now you think about Red Bull, going back to the can design. If they had sold their products in 330ml cans, it would never have taken off because you would have compared the, I don't know, £1.50 that Red Bull charged with 50p for Coke. And people would have thought, well, that's 3 times the price, that's £1 more, that's ridiculous, I could get 3 Cokes, I'm not going to buy that. But by putting into this completely different style of can, you broke the comparison with Coke. It's its own, now Red Bull is its own special kind of universe of products, and you allow this free floating of value to occur. So I think one of the biggest things Red Bull did was in that serving style. And the lesson for advertisers is, if you want people to pay a lot of money for your product, you've got to think to yourself, how do I change the mental comparison set? And there are dozens upon dozens of examples of brands far beyond Red Bull that have done that. But don't just think, I will get people to pay more if I give them more benefits. You've got to think, I'll get them to pay more if I can change the mental comparison set.
Yeah, love that. Well, one of the best repositionings I think I've ever seen in my career was a few years after Red Bull launched, that a competitor, it was actually a kind of a skunk works from Coke, actually called Relentless, launched. I don't know if you remember this, because they ended up getting taken over by Monster. It was like it was a bit like Liquid Death. It was very kind of, it looks like a tattoo. It's kind of very heavy metal kind of thing. Yeah. Anyway, it was a little kind of team, a team of Coke employees who were given freedom to invent a brand and basically take on Red Bull. Yeah. And they decided, it was inspired by Monster in the US. So it was a 500ml can. Yeah. It went the opposite way, right? So what they did is 330ml cans are the default. Red Bull had gone smaller. They went 500ml, which was because everyone thought you wouldn't have a can that big because you can't drink 500ml in one go. But they exaggerated value. And the positioning on it was no half measures, which suddenly made Red Bull appear. So they repositioned Red Bull, they took Red Bull's advantage and actually flipped it on its head and made them look as if they were really stingy.
Interesting.
And then in the end what happens to that one is Coke did a deal with Monster globally, and then they changed Relentless for Monster, which is basically the same model.
Okay. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Well, it connected to it, actually. One of the questions that I thought about after reading your book was the labour illusion, because obviously one of the things you've taught me about very well is signalling effort, right? Yes. So I've spent 10,500 hours, and actually signalling effort, it has an effect. But AI is the opposite. AI is signalling laziness, right?
Absolutely.
So how does that play out?
So, chapter that I probably enjoyed writing most with Michael Aaron was the Dyson chapter. And one of the reasons I really liked it, ironically, was laziness. So I probably shouldn't tell this story. we did quite a lot of research on all the brands, and often you would read, days of information and get nothing interesting. Dyson was the complete opposite. Got the autobiography of James Dyson, opened the first page, and the very first line says, I went through 5,127 prototypes before I came up with the bagless vacuum. And that was like, okay, this is brilliant. That is a behavioural science masterpiece in itself. Because what he's doing, exactly as you say, is he is describing the amount of effort that it took to get to that bagless vacuum. Now, a logician, if that's a thing, would say that's irrelevant. What you should care about is the quality, how well the vacuum sucks dirt up, how beautiful it looks. This effort story is irrelevant. But behavioural scientists would say, well, it doesn't matter what we ought to do. Behavioural scientists are just interested in what actually influences us. And these stories of effort have been proven to make exactly the same product feel higher quality. So the classic study is by Andrea Morales, who's at the University of Southern California. Really simple study. She recruits a group of people who are in market for a house, and she shows them 10 houses that meet their requirements. And some people are told the estate agent took 1 hour to generate the list and they used a computer. The other half of people are told the estate agent took 9 hours and they did it manually. Now, everyone receives exactly the same list of houses. They have the same service from the real estate agent. But when Morales asks those people to rate the quality of service from the estate agent, you get this very different pattern. On a score of 0 to 100, the low effort group rate the estate agent at 50. The high effort group rate the estate agent at 68. So you get this 36% swing in quality. Now, the argument from Morales is judging the quality of a product is a complex question. And she argues, like Daniel Kahneman before her, that when we are faced with complex questions, what we often do is replace them with simpler ones that give them an almost as good answer. So the complex question is, how good is this thing? We can't be bothered to engage with that, so we turn to the simple question, which is, how much effort do I think the brand or the service provider went to? So we use effort as a proxy for quality. So what Dyson is doing brilliantly, you talk about this story of prototypes and years of labour, and you imbue this bagless vacuum with a lot more quality and prestige. I think I loved the Dyson example.
Talking about design, there's a brilliant, almost opposite extreme of this. Paula Scher, I think she's designing a logo for a bank or something, isn't she?
It's the merger of Travellers and Citibank, yeah.
And she comes up with the design on a post-it note in about 5 seconds flat.
Yeah, legend has it, a napkin. So the legend is, she is being briefed, her agency Pentagram, and they have been paid $1.5 million to come up with a logo for this newly merged financial behemoth. In the very meeting, she's getting the brief, she is sketching out, and you can find pictures of it online, maybe stick it in the show notes. She sketches out the now famous umbrella logo. Now, when months later they present back this work to Citibank, Citigroup, whatever it is now, and they give them, Pentagram give this $1.5 million bill. Legend has it that the clients aghast, are like, how in all good faith can you charge us $1.5 million for something we saw you sketch out in the briefing meeting? And her supposed response was, yes, it took me 30 seconds, but it took me 34 years to learn how to do it in 30 seconds. So to me, that is an example of the labour illusion. The client wasn't responding on, is this the right imagery for our bank? Will it help? What they were responding on is, it is unfair for you to ask for this much money for this short amount of work. And what Paula Scher did so brilliantly was, through a sleight of hand, she moved attention not from the speed of delivery, but to the amount of time it took to get into the position to deliver that work. And I think you're right about AI in this area.
Totally.
That people think, and there are experiments by Kobe Millett that back this up, this isn't just my supposition, if you label a product as AI generated, it'll be rated as lower quality than if you say it's hand-drawn. So the thing that Millett did was on a poster. So what I think you need to do is, if you are introducing speeded up services powered by AI, you need, like Paula Scher did, to emphasise the experience, the number of people, the amount of time you've taken to set up the protocols and processes to get this system in place.
Maybe listeners can help me out on this one, but I think there's a very similar story of a very famous ad. Isn't there a very famous ad agency founder who, maybe it's in Cannes, a client asks him for an idea, comes up with it instantly, and the client, same thing. I hope you're not going to charge me for that. He said it took me 27 years to come up with this idea.
Yeah.
Do you know who that is?
I haven't heard that. I've heard a story of an engineer as well, in a giant manufacturer.
Yeah, maybe there's lots of versions of this story.
Yeah. And digging, it seems like the Paula Scher one sounds true, and from the digging that I've done. But this is something I've heard attributed in multiple places, and therefore for me, I think of often that type of story. That's not a peer-reviewed experiment, the Paula Scher story. It's a parable that makes it easier to understand the idea, and I think we can learn as much from those types of parables as from strict historical truths.
Now I want to move us on to chocolate and Snickers, which is a lovely one, and they're now iconic. You're Not You When You're Hungry campaign. And that's a really good example, because I think Snickers have become, I believe, the number one chocolate line in the US now.
Yes.
But it wasn't always the case, and they hit some
I think they
trouble,
might
didn't they?
be, and these things obviously fluctuate, but there was certainly a stage when they were the number one chocolate bar in the world.
Yeah. And there's something about the... so what is it about that particular strapline that works?
There's two elements here. So the first is the use of a cue or a trigger. So psychologists have this phrase, the intention to action gap. And it's the argument that if you create desire for a product, it doesn't necessarily translate into action. You can increase interest or perceived taste, and it might not translate into people buying something. The argument for people like Sarah Milne at the University of Bath is that motivation is a necessary but not sufficient condition for change. What you need to do is, yes, build that motivation, but combine it with a very clear cue or trigger. So this is a time, a place, or a mood that people associate with your products. Now, Snickers, You're Not You When You're Hungry, does a brilliant job of associating consumption with a very clear trigger moment. That feeling of confusion that comes from hunger, that feeling of grumpiness. And it's not talking about how amazing the product tastes. It's associating it brilliantly with a very clearly defined moment. And I think that is something that far more brands could do. It's not like you never see brands doing it. Have a break, have a Kit Kat, Taco Tuesdays, Meat-Free Mondays. Brands do it, but I think it could be applied far more regularly. Too many marketers focus on motivation, not enough on that trigger moment.
Another really, really simple lesson, actually, I think, that comes from Snickers that every marketer could learn from is the use of humour.
Absolutely.
And this is, Absolutely. I mean, there's so much data on this, but the amount of advertising that uses humour has been going down and down and down and down. Equally, I mean, bringing some System 1 data, we've looked at not only the role of happiness, but we've broken happiness into its constituent parts. Actually, funnily enough, there are 15 different types of happiness we've measured. Do you know what the number one is?
Oh, no idea. No,
the number one is Schadenfreude.
Oh, okay, fantastic. Is this British? Brits,
Number two is amusement, right? So the second most effective. Well, they're both humour in ways. They're both obviously humour at someone else's, unfortunate circumstances. But humour, despite humour being very effective as a communication tool, it's used less and less.
I think that is an absolute tragedy. Firstly, there are so many studies into the effect of humour that academics have been able to run meta-analyses. And a meta-analysis is, rather than just taking one paper and extrapolating that out, you look at 50 or 60 or 100 papers and you see what the themes are. And Martin Eisen's done this amazing overview of dozens and dozens of papers and shown that humour consistently in advertising has positive effects. There's also studies that I've done which show if you reach people in a good mood, they're more likely to believe your claims, they're more likely to like your advertising, they're less likely to be price sensitive. So you've got this huge body of work that suggests that humour would be effective, but at the same time we've got this big downturn. I think if we were doing this podcast in the 1990s, making the statement that making your brand likeable and amusing, people would roll their eyes and think it's a statement of the bleeding obvious. Somehow we've forgotten some of the well-proven lessons of the past because I think of our infatuation with the latest new thing, whether it's purpose or data.
Yeah, quite right. We should move on and talk about fried chicken, right? There are very, very many fried chicken brands and outlets in the world. Yeah. There's one that dominates them all, right? Obviously KFC. Why is it that KFC has dominated the fried chicken market in what is a fairly commoditized category?
So one of the things that I think they do really well is this sense of secrecy. You know, the blend of herbs and spices that supposedly no one knows the recipe, or there's two people in the world, they're not allowed to travel on the same plane, they're manufacturers, one does half of the spices, the other one does the other, and then KFC mix it up. And I think there's something amazing about having a secret, this kind of information gap that you never quite resolve. And it means that the story or the brand sticks in people's minds. So there's an amazing study by a Soviet psychologist called Bluma Zygarnik. And actually, maybe the best way to talk about her insight is not necessarily the experiment, it comes to the experiment later, but what got her to come up with the idea. And back in the 1920s, she goes to a cafe with her mentor, Kurt Lewin, and a few other students. They sit down, waiter comes out, no pen or paper, takes the order, quite a complicated order. There probably wasn't like soy and oat milk, but there were, pastries and espressos and double espressos. And 3 or 4 minutes later, he comes back, gives the order out. Everyone gets the right mix of drinks and food. She's quite impressed. They finish their drinks, they wander off, and as she is leaving, she's only about 5 or 10 minutes away from the cafe, she realised she's left her scarf. She goes back to the cafe, spots the waiter with the amazing memory, and she goes up to him and says, "Oh, have you spotted my scarf?" And the guy looks at her blankly, and she quickly realises this guy has no idea who she is. And she begins to wonder to herself, how can his memory be really good that he can take this order perfectly, but so bad he cannot remember me half an hour later? And what she begins to think is we are much better at remembering uncompleted tasks than completed tasks. And from there, once she has that hypothesis, she then runs a few simple studies. She brings people into a lab, gets them to fulfill a task like building a cardboard box or some such thing. Some people are given the instructions and then they build the box. Other people are given the instructions and then they start building the box, and then she stops them and takes them away. When those groups are later on asked to repeat the instructions back, the people that were interrupted can remember far more details. It's about a 90% improvement in detail level. So she has this anecdote that inspires her, and then she proves it experimentally. Now you bring that back to KFC, and I think some of the enduring fascination is their maintenance of this secret. Really, what herbs and spices are in KFC is completely trivial and unimportant. But the fact that you've left this kind of itch, you haven't told people you've got this itch that you haven't ever scratched, that makes it stick in people's mind. Even very trivial information, if you leave an element of uncertainty, an element of secrecy, it will be more memorable and more motivating. So many things I talk about in the book about KFC, along with Michael Aaron, but that is the one that kind of sticks with me.
Yeah, love that a lot.
In fact, what we should have done is finish the podcast halfway through that explanation.
We should have done, shouldn't we? I know, exactly. Well, we have to come up with something else to half finish at the end of the podcast. Yeah. It also explains why the moment I finished my economics degree, I couldn't tell you anything. I remember in my first job at Britvic, a few months after leaving my degree, someone asked me to explain the capital asset pricing model. And I literally looked blankly and thought, I could have written that in detail 3 months ago. Yeah. Now I'm like, what is that again?
but also from an evolutionary basis, this makes sense. If the task has been completed, it's less valuable than something we're in the midst of. It makes absolute sense why we would have adopted this particular bias.
And another interesting thing I think is going to broad applicability to marketers is you talk about Pringles.
Yes.
And Pringles, of course, is a rather unusual shape.
Yes.
And
Saddleback, I think it's
is
referred to.
that
I think
the
that's what they say. Yeah.
official term, and comes in a tube rather than the packet. So why did Pringles end up being how they are? But also, what role did the kind of now famous slogan play?
The reason they are in that strange tube is one of the irritations post-war people had was getting packets, and they were, buying packets of crisps, and a lot of them would be crushed and in little pieces. So the tube was meant to be a solution to that. In terms of, and the chapter was quite fun as well because there's quite a lot of idiosyncratic little stories about Pringles. But the bias that I think is super interesting is this idea of the Keats heuristic. So the strapline for a long time with Pringles was once you pop, you can't stop. Now that's interesting for two reasons. The believability of the statement is boosted by rhyme, and then so is the memorability. So the first statement is an idea called the Keats heuristic. So back in the late 90s, Jessica Toffig-Bash, I might have pronounced that wrong, and Matthew McGlone run a really clever study. They make fake proverbs like woes unite foes, and then they create two versions. You read woes unite foes, and I read the non-rhyming version, woes unite enemies. And we see a kind of jumbled up list. You might get half a dozen that rhyme and half a dozen that don't, and I'll get, the different pairs. And what would happen is, again and again, the people that saw the rhyming phrase, they believe that statement more than the people saw the non-rhyming phrase. According to the psychologists, there is a fluency and ease of processing to rhyme, and people conflate ease of processing with truth. Now, what's fascinating about that study is when people were later asked, why did you think this proverb was, a fair reflection of the world? Why did you think it was truthful? Was it because of the rhyme? Only one person in the whole of their experiment attributed believability to rhyme. Everyone else said, no, I just solely judged believability on the inherent information that you were giving me. The rhyme was totally irrelevant. Again and again, what people say motivates them, and what actually motivates them, completely different things. Now, the scale of the impact of that study isn't huge. It's like 15 or 17% swing in believability. And when I read it, I thought, that's super interesting. But actually, I always think the big thing about rhyme is not just that it's believable, but it's memorable. Coughs and sneezes spread diseases, less bother with a hover, once you pop, you can't stop. Some of these rhymes, they go back 20 years, they're still stick in our mind. Don't be vague, ask for Haig, it's 100 years old, but they stick in our mind. And I wanted to test whether that was a genuine thing. So reran originally, for the illusion of choice, I reran McGlone and Toffig-Bash's study, but I used a non-representative audience. And what I did was, I think it was Alex Thompson I did this. We showed people the proverbs in the morning, and everyone would have a slightly different mix of proverbs, sometimes rhyming, sometimes not. And what we found is if we regrouped those people in the afternoon and we asked them to remember the proverbs, people were twice as likely to remember the rhyming ones as the non-rhyming ones. And I thought that's a massive impact, but I never really talked about it hugely because it was an unrepresentative audience. So what we did for this book with Michael Aaron and also Nicky Morley and John Paulston was we reran that study. It's a few different little tweaks, but reran that rhyme study to show, yes, it is much, much more memorable. So a very well-known tactic, but one that has completely fallen out of fashion, that I think, again, we could learn far more from Pringles.
It really has. A link to that in terms of going out of fashion, actually, jingles. So we did a study with TikTok at System 1, and we looked at different types of brand device, right? So like slogans, logos, jingles, all those kind of things, and looked at the use of them in the first 2.5 seconds, which is broadly what you've got to get your point across, and linked it to a brand awareness and indexed it. And the number one thing, which was something like a 200% overperformance versus the average, sonic devices. Incredible. Like what, those unique sounds that we associate with brands. Again, they're things that aren't used very often, but can be incredibly powerful.
And in any book, I think every book's been about 40, 50,000 words. There's probably 200,000 words that you just relentlessly cut back, cut. I'm a big believer. There's this wonderful phrase from Quilla Couch, murder your darlings. You know, the biggest thing about writing is what you leave out, not what you kind of put down, just relentless editing. And I think one of the very early studies we had, but dropped because it was kind of a bit of a cul-de-sac, was a study around Alzheimer's patients. And even when people had lost memory of hugely important, meaningful things, a lot of the time they could still remember and sing ditties and essentially jingles. There's something, very persistent about that form of communication.
Well, I saw a really, really funny. So I don't know if you've seen it, but I think it was ITV, maybe ITV and Thinkbox. It was basically a bit like Gogglebox. You know when they film people watching the ads?
Yeah.
And the exam question was, how many people are actually watching TV ads during the ad break, right? And then it probably told you what you'd imagine, right? Something, I think, I'm guessing slightly, around a third of people were actually paying attention to the ads, right? What they discovered is something like 70% of people were listening to the ads, so more than twice the number.
Yeah.
And there's this very, very funny thing in the debrief, because they show you these clips of people, and you've got this kind of couple lounging on the sofa, and the conversation they're having is like, seriously, does anyone watch ads these days? I mean, come on, this is ridiculous. The Just Eat ad comes on. He turns to his missus and goes, did somebody say? And then they literally go, should we get a takeaway? And there's no hint of irony. Literally, they haven't even realised that in the same sentence they've completely contradicted themselves. But what was interesting, the interesting thing about that is they weren't looking at the television.
Yeah.
They heard, did somebody say? So they literally heard the jingle or the strapline in song, and that was the trigger. To them. And I think this is something that, we did another study actually where not only does music and sonic devices create awareness, but it changes meaning. So we did this test a few years ago now actually with Werther's Original, and they were testing different soundtracks on the same advert.
Ooh.
Really interesting. So in these, there are 3 different soundtracks, and it went from a 3-star to a 5-star. So firstly, the emotional response was dramatically different. But the real kicker for me was that in the 3-star, it was a dad and his daughter, and they were sort of playing in a park. In the 3-star, with the music, the association was he must be divorced and it must be a visitation day, right?
Yeah.
In the 5-star, they interpreted it as it must be her birthday and they must be celebrating.
Yeah.
And the visuals are the same, but the music completely changed how people felt and also the association.
Oh, that's brilliant. One of the stats that sticks in my mind from the brilliant How Not to Plan by Sarah Carter and Les Binet is they look at the kind of walk database, and this might have changed because the book was 5 years old, but what proportion of papers on there are about music, and it is absolutely vanishing small. It's something like 0.1%. It's absolutely tiny. It's such a powerful tool, yet I think it gets far less status and respect than it should do.
You can almost write a book on unfashionable but highly effective things you can do.
Okay.
Like
so I'll see you back here in 2029 for podcast 4.
We'll do that for our podcast 4, shall we? Yeah, that'd be brilliant. Well, maybe to wrap up, we haven't talked about tech very much. And maybe we'll kind of end on Apple. And I thought this was a very, very classic example of the idea of concreteness as well, which I thought was interesting. How did Apple use the idea of concrete expressions to change?
So concrete expressions are things that we can visualise. So the classic study, 1972 by Ian Begg, reads out a list of phrases. Sometimes they are concrete, like white horse or square door. These are tangible, visualisable items, and people are very good at remembering those. 36% of the concrete words are remembered later on. But the other half of the words he reads out are abstract phrases, intangible concepts like basic truth or impossible amount, things that you cannot visualise. And when people are later asked to remember those, a mere 9% are remembered. So you've got this massive 4-fold difference in memorability. According to Begg, vision's the most powerful of our senses. So if you use language people can visualise, it's very sticky. If you use language people can't visualise, it's very forgettable. Now, that is a very, very powerful memory tool. But if you think about most communications, they break that rule. Brands are talking about quality, refreshment, trustworthiness, premiumness. They're too often resorting to abstract ideas that are very hard for people to remember. Now, the Apple example is quite an old one, but it proves the point. And it's back in the days when all those MP3 players were coming out. Now, what most MP3 players did was try and convey storage and memory by talking about megabytes. So like 512 megabytes of memory. The problem with that is you cannot picture a megabyte, you can't imagine 512, so it's a very poor piece of communication, it's forgettable. But if you think about what Apple did, exactly the same challenge. They still wanted to convey memory and storage, but this time they converted that abstract idea into something you could picture. 1,000 songs in your pocket. And because you can picture a pocket, you can imagine a song, it's much, much stickier. So one of the things that Apple do so brilliantly, and there are others, but one of the things they do brilliantly is this use of concrete visualizable language. And I think the point to stress here is, yes, simple language is good. There's other studies that back that up. But simple and concrete are not the same thing. Concrete is you can visualize it, not just that it's easy to understand.
I think you've destroyed pretty much every car advertising strapline.
I think we've criticised them on every
possibilities. Or
just a word
weird,
jumble. There's a giant. I don't know.
Today is now
a tombola of words
yeah.
that someone's churning out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I know there's a lot of that. The other thing, actually, talking about technology, which we use a lot at System One, actually, is this concept of most advanced yet acceptable. We took a System One take on it, actually, which is quite interesting, which is we call it the 80-20 rule, but the right blend of familiarity to novelty is 80-20. So if you have, basically happiness versus surprise as the motivating factor. If you have too much surprise in a concept, it's got too much novelty, then it gets rejected. If it's too familiar, then it doesn't have enough novelty to pique your interest. So there's this sort of roughly 80-20 balance that we've kind of worked out. I mean, John Kieran, our founder, just went through tens of thousands of successful innovations, looked at the emotion it created, and this seems to be the sort of magic number that gets it right.
So, the other part of the Apple chapter is about this idea of most advanced yet acceptable. So I hadn't heard about the 80-20 work you've done, which is, I think, sounds brilliant. But the other thing Apple did when they launched the iPhone is apply that principle. So radical new technology. Therefore, they want to make it a little bit more familiar. And what they did with all the icons was use kind of 3D imagery. The buttons looked like you could press them. And they used real world kind of analogies and metaphors. I'm not sure the right term there. But the notepad would be a yellow legal notepad. I think the podcast button was a reel-to-reel tape recorder. Even when you went to the notepad, it wasn't just that it was a notepad. You deleted a page and there were little tears left on. The font that was used looked like a kind of pen had drawn it. Again and again, they try and make this radical technology a little bit more familiar. But then, of course, and they call this skeuomorphism, as the iPhone becomes more accepted, all those real-world analogies disappear. The 3D-ness changes, it all becomes flat. It's a lovely example of someone recognising that the communication approach, the product design approach, isn't the right thing at all times. You want to make, and this is Derek Thompson's phrase, if you're trying to sell something surprising, make it familiar, and if you want to sell something familiar, make it surprising. And I think Apple on the iPhone did that brilliantly.
They absolutely did. Now, I was going to talk to you about how social media are using the behavioural science biases of gambling, but given the unfinished rule that I think leaves people wanting more, I think we'll end it here.
Fantastic. I love that. Yes,
and then they'll all be wondering. So
yeah.
If you want to find out how social media resembles gambling, you'll need to get hold of this amazing book, Hacking the Human Mind, which is out now. So get online, Google it, and you can get a copy. It's amazing, as all your books are, really. And I love how you bridge the gap between the kind of academic behavioural science and real world practicality, which is
fantastic. That's definitely the aim. Keep it simple, and there's no point now about these biases if they're just little interesting tales. The point is to apply them, and that's what we're trying to make it really super practical.
Well, you've delivered my number one behavioural bias desire, which is make it easy.
Excellent.
Right.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Excellent.
Good to see you again, mate.
Very good to see you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for listening or watching Uncensored CMO. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please do hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching, hit subscribe there as well. I'd also love to get a review. Reviews make a big difference on other people discovering the show. So please do leave a review wherever you get your podcast. If you want to contact me, you can do. I'm over on X at UncensoredCMO or on LinkedIn, where I'm under my own name, John Evans. Thanks for listening and watching. I'll see you next time.